Hey guys, in this video I want to talk about the difference between an employee and a founder, CEO, businessman, entrepreneur, or businesswoman. And so let's start with the book Rich Dad Poor Dad. So this is a very well-known book. Many copies have been sold, and one of its big themes is this whole idea of you want to remove yourself from the employee bracket and turn yourself into a investor or owner in assets that can make you money, which pretty much means something like you pretty much own a business or you pretty much own something that makes you money rather than work for someone. And so that was like the one of the central themes of the book, and it's actually a concept that's inspired a ton of people. In fact, I'm sure some of you guys have already read this book, so you know more or less what this is about. Now, personally, in my opinion, I found the book to be very interesting and it's great for a beginner, but I do think that it leaves people kind of confused what to do from there. So I'm going to address that, and also if you're an entrepreneur or you're in a business now, there are certain mindset shifts that can really revolutionize how well you work in a business, which I'll talk about in this video. So stay tuned. All right, so let's begin. Let's start with the Rich Dad Poor Dad frame. So I think I've seen a lot of people who have this issue. They think the book is just, it leaves them kind of with their hands up in the air. They're inspired, they're interested, but they don't know what to do from there. Some of them end up eventually taking action, but others are kind of confused. And to be frank, it is a sort of introductory beginner type book. And I've read a lot of his other books, and they are somewhat generalized. Um, Unfortunately, critics say that the book just emphasizes very general concepts on real estate and how real estate is the way to go and how you have to start a business to make money. And it just leaves it there in a very vague type situation. Now, I partially agree with that. So I think the solution to move forward from there is uh, really start thinking about what you can do specifically. I personally agree with Warren Buffett and pretty much thousands, if not millions, of other successful people who tell you to do something you're really interested in. And so, if that's not real estate, don't go into real estate. It's funny because people can fall into this trap of, I'm going to convince myself that I'm interested in this, even if I'm not. But because there's money there, I'll convince myself to a certain extent. And I think we all do this to a certain extent. But unfortunately, it keeps you from progressing sometimes, especially when you hit a wall and you keep trying to pursue something like real estate when in fact it's probably not where you should go. So keep that in mind. And honestly, this whole real estate thing, I think it's highly overhyped. And like with pretty much every business, um, eventually too many people flood into it and it can get very hyper competitive. And I personally don't think that most people will be making tons of money through real estate. So I would say follow your interests. I think that's one of the core things that you should look to. Obviously, with, you know, I would call it street savvy. So I've done a lot of videos on following your passion, and I have a whole playlist on that. So you can look at that for more details on what I'm trying to say. However, let's move on from that. Now, what can you actually do other than just find things that are businesses or assets to pursue? Well, one thing you can do is you can find something that you're interested in and see what companies or businesses create that. Now, you don't necessarily have to start a business to be successful or be in something like this. However, since it's one of the primary ways of accumulating a lot of wealth, and because we're going to be talking about entrepreneurs, let's just go there. So one thing that's critical is understanding the difference between an entrepreneur and an employee. So unfortunately, I think one of the huge hangups that a lot of entrepreneurs, or whatever you want to call them, founders, businessmen, what they do is they will stay in the employee mindset while transitioning from an employee to an entrepreneur. Now, nowadays, that term, as well as businessman, founder, CEO, they're very glamorized and so forth. And some argue they should be, and it's partially true, but that was not always the case. Again, it's a lot of tough work, and most of the time it's very tough, and most people don't succeed at it. So again, keep that in mind. It's not all fun and peaches. Now, understanding that when you're an entrepreneur or a businessman, and again, I'm not just saying this from my own mouth. This is from a very well-known book called E-Myth Revisited by Michael Gerber, and he talks and emphasizes about this a lot. Millions of copies of that book has been sold, and he talks about the entrepreneur myth and dispels a lot of things that you should avoid. So one of the key things he says is you have to start thinking like an entrepreneur or businessman when you're in a business. Now, if you're still thinking like an employee, and let me just be very specific here so you understand what I'm saying. An example of being like an employee would be like, oh, I'm trading dollars for hours. If you keep thinking like that as a businessman, you will not do well, because guess what? You can put in 3 times as many hours, but the results are really what matter. So if you could do that in a fraction of the time, or 3x the time you thought it would, doesn't matter. Until you provide value to your customers, the more value the better, it doesn't really matter. You're not getting paid. So it really changes the whole dynamic, and the best people, in my opinion, they start to realize that you have to cut out the crap. And a lot of businessmen, Bill Gates, he was a huge procrastinator when he was in Harvard, but when he started a business, it completely changed, because that stuff doesn't fly anymore, and you really learn to cut out any fat or inefficiencies. So what does this mean? Stop thinking of trading hours for dollars. In order for a business to have longevity, it requires blood or life force. And that life force comes with money. Without money, you can't pay your employees, you can't do anything, you can't provide a service to other people. So in order to have that longevity of a positive, thriving cash flow, you can't be screwing around. You know, a lot of people, and I do think even today, especially with like startup companies and so forth, some of them may luck out and get a lot of money or whatever else happens, and they're just screwing around, and they get away with it for a decent while, maybe a few years. But ultimately, things start catching up to them. It's like, what do you have to do to be the most efficient? And as the founder, there's no more trading hours for dollars anymore, which you think is a good thing, but in certain ways it's like, it's tough. It's difficult, because you cut out a lot of the fat. It's like, okay, I may have gotten away with maybe 2 hours of screwing around and not doing much, but it didn't matter because I got paid by the hour. Now it's all about efficiency. And the thing here is, some businessmen, some entrepreneurs, businesswomen, they still don't realize this. So they're still being mediocre. They're having a mediocre business that has mediocre cash flow, and they don't know why, and they don't realize that you can't be screwing around anymore, and they are screwing around and just wasting time. So keep these things in mind, and also realize that another key point of this mindset shift is you have to start delegating and doing, and really figuring out, what do I do to provide the most value to customers, to my employees. Employees are also very important. How can I do this? How can I take care of these people? How can I provide tremendous value to these people? And that oftentimes requires delegation. It oftentimes requires you to stop thinking like someone who just, swipes his card and trades dollars for hours. And some, a ton of people, they never make that shift. And they're always an employee. In fact, I very well could have never thought about it this way if I didn't start learning about this stuff, because it just shifts your whole mindset. When you've been an employee for a long time, you're just looking at what can I do to please the boss. And some people are perfectly fine with that. A lot of entrepreneurs do not, which is why they start their own company. But a lot of employees, they like being an employee and they're fine with that. But their whole mindset is, oh, I'm just going to do this. I'm going to do that. I'm going to, increase the conversions here. I'm going to do this. And they're just looking at fancy numbers or stats or whatever it is, to look good to their boss, or maybe look good to their company or future possible employer. And that's